Good evening, everyone. I'm Yuan Hui. I am the docent of the School of Philosophy of Huazhong University of Science and Technology. It is my honor to welcome our speaker, Professor Anton Friedrich Koch, the Emeritus Professor from the Department of Philosophy at University of Heidelberg, to give us his first lecture on Hegel. The title is From Finitude to Essence. Before the lecture starts, please allow me to give a short personal introduction about Professor Koch. For those audience who is new here, Professor Koch's research focuses on classical Greek metaphysics, German idealism, and analytic philosophy. He's a member of the Heidelberg Academy der Wissenschaft, the Academy of Science and Humanity of the land Baden-Württemberg. Professor Koch has published numerous papers and books. Some of them concern Hegel or German idealism, such as the evolution of the logical space, the Evolution des logischen Raums, reason and sensuality in practical thinking, Vernunft und Sinnlichkeit in praktischen Denken. Other expresses his own creative philosophical thoughts, such essay on truth and time, Versuch über Wahrheit und Zeit, and truth, time and freedom, Wahrheit, Zeit und Freiheit, Einführung in eine philosophische Theorie. Professor Koch has taught in many prominent universities worldwide, such as the University of Munich, the professor of the University of Tübingen, the University of Chicago. Okay, that's all. Let's welcome Professor Koch, and I shall now give the floor to the Professor Koch.
Yeah, thank you so much for this warm welcome, and good evening to all of you. It's 7 o'clock in China. I learned it's 12 o'clock high noon in Germany. So yes, I'm very glad and honored to have the opportunity to talk to you. Okay, so let's start. Let us start with a brief recapitulation. In the last lecture, we looked at the antinomy of negation. In the foreground logic, it initially appears unarticulated as the nothing, and then articulated for the first time as the other of itself. Of course, in the background logic, Hegel looks for a way out of the antinomy and finds a dual one, with first an affirmative and second a negative flank, which, however, remain enclosed by third an apparatic overall perspective in which the dual way out proves insufficient. On the affirmative flank, the other of itself is the other of the other. That is, firstly, the something that is again identical with itself through double otherness, otherness of otherness. On the negative flank, the other of itself is secondly the other as such, the Platonic idea or Platonic form of the other, so to speak, and thus the other in its pure shape, which has always already divided logical space into a something identical with itself and the other. If we look at both flanks in a stereoscopic view, we get the overall apparatic perspective in which the other of itself is seen for what it is, the antinomy of negation in the specific shape of the antinomic self-relation of otherness, which makes itself felt in the logic of Dasein as, thirdly, constant alteration and coming out of itself. Let us now go further and conclude our overview of the logic of quality by briefly and summarily treating the finite and the infinite, thereby reaching the end of Hegel's second chapter, and then being for itself, or für sich sein, the topic of Hegel's third chapter. Then we will move on and consider also quite summarily the path from being to essence, which leads through the two stations, or rather sections, on quantity and on measure. So now let's talk about the finite, the infinite, and being for itself. It's an overview. In the designer's perspective of the background logic, the outlined situation can be explicated as follows. If in the infinite formulae that we used last time to indicate self-negation, so you remember the infinite series of negation signs plus perhaps brackets, and more specifically to indicate the other of itself by an infinite series of the functor alpha plus, again, brackets, we put the negation signs, or if in these series we put the negation signs together in pairs, respectively, then, because double negation is affirmation, we get non-well-founded affirmation out of non-well-founded negation instead of non-well-founded negation. And more specifically, in the second case, non-well-founded transverse affirmation, that is, the something which is identical with itself. In colloquial language, this corresponds to the so-called truth-telling sentences, like this one, sentence T. The sentence you're currently reading or hearing is true. The sentence T, the so-called truth-teller, is true insofar as we assume it to be true, and false insofar as we assume it to be false. It's a bit strange, weird sentence, but not obviously inconsistent. In the logic of Dasein, it becomes the aforementioned something which is identical with itself. But we must immediately concede that infinitely many negation signs are not evenly many. Perhaps then one of them will be left over in the pairwise summation. In order to avoid one-sidedness, we take this alternative possibility into account as a second possibility by recognizing not only the case of non-well-founded affirmation, that is the truth-teller, but also the case where one negation sign is left over, yielding the negation of the truth-teller. So that's the sentence N. The truth-teller, that is sentence T, is not true. In the logic of Dasein, this means we have to juxtapose to the something identical with itself also the other, its alternative. This was exactly Hegel's dual way out, his recognition of a bipartite logical space. But an infinite number of negation signs are not only not even numbered, but also not odd numbered. So far, then, we and Hegel have merely corrected one inadmissible one-sidedness with another, but left the core problem untouched, the apparetic overall perspective. This perspective becomes apparent in the progression of the logic of Dasein, in that the limit or border, Grenze, that divides logical space between something and the other turns out to be, in the last analysis, a non-well-founded limit of itself, known as the finite. As a result, the something and its other eventually turn out to be one and the same finite. So logical space is reunited again as the finite. This means that logical space itself at this stage becomes finite and incoherent, eternally annihilating itself, and in every act of self-annihilation, rising again as a new finite, and so on to the infinite. One would certainly like to be able to take this phrase, and so on to the infinite, literally here, and understand it affirmatively, namely to the effect that the finite actually progresses beyond itself to a transfinite goal and there rises to the infinite, to a truly infinite logical space. So logical space should become infinite again. However, it first requires a series of theoretical measures in the background logic in order to see how this can happen in the end, contrary to our initial expectations. One main idea is that in the infinite progress of the many finites annihilating each other, none of them remains unnegated and unannihilated. Every finite, that is, every finite shape of logical space annihilates its predecessor and is in turn annihilated by its successor. Therefore, one does not do them an alien violence, but takes their own negativity seriously when one thinks their whole infinite series is negated in one infinite general negation. And so there's this formula there. You see it's bracketed as a block and then negated. The series, the infinite series of finites, is bracketed and negated as a block. That's the infinite. The resulting other of the whole series is the non-finite, or the infinite, unendliche. Endlich in German, well, things that have an end are endlich, finite, and unendlich, infinite. This infinite logical space is the opposite of the whole series of the infinitely many finites, which together make up the one collectively total finite. So you have the collective total finite there within the brackets. Obviously, however, this can only be an interim solution, and an inadequate one at that. For it would lead to conceiving the infinite and the collective finite on the model of something and the other with a limit in between, thus restaging the problem to be solved. The finite must rather be de-actualized and reduced to something merely ideal, so that it can no longer stand opposite the infinite, but is now essentially sublated, and substantially sublated by and in the infinite. The new form of negation is therefore not a mere annihilation or shadowing anymore, but, as Hegel calls it, idealization. The finite is not annihilated or shadowed by the infinite, but sublated and idealized. Mere sublation doesn't suffice. It has to be idealized. That's a specific form of sublation. Negation is thus determined as ideality, says Hegel. So that's the new form of negation that we're looking for, ideality. And he goes on, ideality can be called the quality of infinity. Negation was initially longitudinal negation, and more specifically, annihilation. Annihilation without a trace. Sublation, on the other hand, is negation that preserves the negated qua negated. In the propositional realm, this is a triviality. That Socrates lives is sublated in Socrates no longer lives as a past. In propositional thinking, we can easily think about what has passed and no longer exists. So in our normal propositional thinking, sublation is a trivial operation. But in the realm of pre-propositional thinking, sublation is an extra. And it takes some theoretical measures to reach the point where the other is not merely shadowed by the something, but is also sublated in the something as being for it, for the something. The problem of finitude was that the other sublated in the something continued at the same time to exist as a qualitative entity being there, Daseinendes, unsublated. So that was the problem in the logic of Dasein. The other was firstly sublated in the something. It was for the something, had been for some other, for the something. But apart from that, the other continued existing beside the something, sublated and unsublated. So again, in the propositional realm, that's trivial. So I'm presently sitting here in my room, but I can think of the university, of the rooms in the university, which aren't here. So they are sublated in my thinking. I can think of them, but still they exist independently beside my thinking them. So, well, again, in the propositional realm, to be sublated and to exist unsublated goes together well. But that was the problem here in the logic of the finitude, that the finite didn't disappear. It went on existing besides being sublated in some other. Okay. The problem of finitude was that the other sublated into something, continued to exist at the same time as a qualitative entity being there, Dasein is unsublated. Infinity, on the other hand, is the total sublation of the finite. That is its idealization, total sublation. There is no independent existence any longer there. The standpoint of finitude is that of realism, a standpoint which is characteristic of the duality of consciousness, that is, of our everyday practice of raising objective claims to knowledge and truth. What we claim to know and what is insofar supposed to be sublated for us in our knowledge, we at the same time presuppose as existing independently of our knowledge in itself, and understand ourselves ipso facto as epistemically finite, that is fallible. Hegel claims that philosophy as such goes beyond this standpoint of realism and finitude and is essentially idealism and the theory of the infinite. Not only naturalistic and materialistic, but also hermeneutic variants of realism are incompatible with this, including Heidegger's hermeneutic phenomenology. And I'm sad to say, including my own hermeneutic realism. So I cannot be a Hegelian. I take the standpoint of finitude to be the last word in philosophy. Okay, ideal in the Hegelian sense is that which is the case or exists only as a sublated entity and not also as an unsublated one. In this sense, ideality is a form of negation qua negatively stained quality. And idealization is a form of the operation of negating. The finite is negated by and in the affirmative and true infinite to the effect that A, it has always already been sublated, and B, it can in no way continue to exist as another, alongside the infinite. The reality in the higher sense, says Hegel, of the infinite is then at the same time the ideality in the higher sense and the quality of infinity. In the infinite, therefore, a double side, as Hegel calls it, of ideality is revealed, I quote, namely, that on the one hand, that which is ideal is the concrete, the truly existent, but that on the other hand, its moments are just as much the ideal, sublated in it. In fact, however, there's only one concrete whole from which the moments are inseparable. End of quote. Ideality in this higher and highly Janus-faced sense may have been before Fichte's eyes when he determined the self-positing I that is for itself as the quintessence of all realities. This ideality is a variant of non-well-founded self-related negation, namely more concretely idealization of itself. So negation qua idealization turned upon itself. This is so because affirmative infinity is the idealization not only of finitude as such, but also of the infinity that is only opposite to finitude, the only negative infinity. By virtue of the latter point, infinity is negatively related to itself, that is negation relating to itself, or circular negation, self-negation. And therefore, that Dasein or being there, which is called für sich sein or being for itself, yeah, that's it. So it's Dasein that is called für sich sein, that is being for itself. Which brings us to the third and last chapter of the logic of quality. And you see, I'm just giving overviews now here on these parts of the logic. Sublating and positing, tollere and ponere in Latin, aufheben and setzen, are logical counter movements. But whatever is the case or exists only as something that is posited by another, and not also independently of its being posited by this other, is ipso facto sublated in that other, and more specifically idealized, and thus ideal. So here, in the case of idealization, the counter movements of sublating and positing converge in their respective effects. That's a significant thing. The counter movements of sublating and positing converge in their respective effects. What, however, is not posited by something else, but posits itself and does not occur independently of its self-positing, like Fichte's I, is ideal in the higher, the affirmative sense, and it is thus being for itself, für sich sein. This is the special case of self-idealization or non-well-founded idealization. Fichte's self-positing I is a case in point, and therefore has Hegelian being for itself as its logical basis, that is, as its basis in terms of the logic of being, one has to say. However, the chapter Being for Itself, which concludes the logic of quality, also, and most importantly, deals with the Janus-faced instability of the ideality of itself. An instability which fits Jacobi's suspicion of nihilism towards Fichte. Ideality of itself lacks the hardness of finite reality, so that it cannot keep its aspects or moments, that is, itself as actively positing, as an actively positing being for itself, and itself as the posited being for one, separate. These two moments have therefore always already, as Hegel says, collapsed into indistinguishability. Hegel goes on, being for itself is thus an entity which is for itself, and in its inner meaning disappears in this immediacy, the quiet abstract limit of itself, the one. The one, then, is self-idealization collapsed into immediacy, while the initial nothing at the beginning of the logic was the still unarticulated self-negation in general, that is, indeterminate absolute negativity, which, moreover, had pure being as its counterpart in an inconsistent way. The one, on the other hand, has only itself and is therefore also, in this sense, just for itself. It's solitary, so to speak, and separate. In Greek, one would say houris, that is, entirely on its own, like an Aristotelian substance. Substances in Aristotle are solitary, separate, houris, for themselves. So this being for itself is Janus-faced even in that respect. In its negative self-relation, its formerly soft ideality has, as Hegel says, turned into the most solid, the hardest, die härteste, most abstract reality. If we stop for a while and consider the career of logical space up to now, we find that logical space began as homogeneous qualitative Dasein and then split into something and another, and thus became the finite, which, reaching beyond an infinite progression of finites, rose to the infinite and finally became an infinite, a self-idealizing being for itself. Now, however, the infinite logical space of being for itself, that is of higher ideality, has collapsed into a hard and hostile, negatively self-referential point, a space to a point, the infinite space just to one point. A negatively self-referential point which, for lack of an other, that could be the target of its negativity and hostility, cannot stand itself, as it were, and thus repels itself from itself to many of its equals, many ones, which soon repel each other, just as they originally owe themselves to repulsion. Here again, we find, this time in repulsion, the indifference of logical and matter-of-factual relations, the core of which we had before our eyes already right at the beginning in the coincidence of being, intuiting, and thinking. Well, pure being was thinking, intuiting, and being. Logical space is now, at the present stage of its evolution, devoid of classical atomism, in which many ones mutually repel themselves as metaphysical atoms. To their repulsion in the foreground logic corresponds, in our background logic, the abstract, punctiform negativity of the one that we detected. But in the background logic, the multiplicity of the ones, since the latter are completely indistinguishable, presents itself as a violation of the weak, purely logical law of the identity of indiscernibles. This law says, if nothing, absolutely nothing is true of X, that is not also true of Y, then X and Y are not two items, but one and the same. And we have this situation here. The multiplicity of the indiscernible ones is thus untrue and transitory. In the foreground logic, this is expressed by a counter movement to repulsion, by attraction. So this logical law of the identity of indiscernibles presents or manifests itself in the foreground logic as attraction. The many mutually repelling ones also attract each other, which in the end leads via a temporary equilibrium of repulsion and attraction to the one of attraction. and thus to quantity as the new logical basic fact, the new overall shape of logical space. Plato, in his oral, unwritten doctrine, declared the one, Greek hen, to be the affirmative and formal principle of the realm of forms, realm of ideas. In contrast to this Platonic henological, hen, the one, henological, the metaphysics, a metaphysics that looks to the hen, not to the on. So it's henology, not ontology. So in contrast to this Platonic henological metaphysics, the henology of Hegel's logic, the doctrine of the one, the henology of Hegel's logic, is firstly transitory. For here, the one must eventually give way to a successor shape of logical space. And secondly, Hegel's transient henology is atomistic, not idea theoretical or form theoretical in the sense of Plato. Similar to Plato's metaphysical henology, however, Hegel's logical henology paves the way to a metaphysics of mathematics, albeit, of course, again, a transitory one, which grasps logical space in its successor shape as quantity. So that was all I have to say on the logic of quality, and now my remarks on quantity and measures from being to essence. Thus, after quality, now quantity. But the logic of quantity and the logic of measure are largely skipped over in these lectures. I have to admit, the time is missing. Briefly, only this much. Quantity, as Hegel says, is the determinateness which has become indifferent to being, the repulsion of the many ones, which is immediately non-repulsion, continuity and of them, end of quote. As pure, not yet limited, it is the logical archetype of, as Hegel says, I quote, space and time, also matter in general, light, and so on, even I. End of quote. That is the archetype of whatever is continuous, the archetype of the continuous, whereby space as the absolute being outside itself and time as the absolute coming outside of self form probably the most striking extralogical examples of pure quantity. Since quantity inherits its two moments from being for itself, namely continuity and discreteness as successors to attraction and repulsion, it appears in two forms, as continuous and also as discrete quantity. Space and natural numbers, discrete. This duality points to an internal limit between its two sides. So mathematics classically had been Euclidean geometry, theory of space, and arithmetic, the theory of natural numbers and of discrete quanta. And there's a limit between it. Geometry is geometry and arithmetic is arithmetic. Okay. Okay. So this duality points to an internal limit between its two sides. Thus, the initially pure quantity is now limited within itself and becomes a quantum as limited and a number as quantum. So now we are going into the logical basis of number theory. Frege famously rejected the classical notion of number as a discrete quantum, Anzahl in German. There's no English word for that number, Zahl, Anzahl. So I say quantum instead of just number. A discrete quantum of equal units. So 7 is a quantum of 7 units, and 8 a quantum of 8 units, and so on. And Frege rejected that classical notion that goes back to Aristotle as inconsistent, because equal units would not be distinguishable. Remember the law of the identity of indiscernibles, and would therefore be numerically identical according to this law of the identity of indiscernibles. And so Frege said, no, 5 cannot be the set or whatever Anzahl quantum of 5 units which are indistinguishable. On the one side, they have to be indistinguishable. Otherwise, if you take one of them away to get 4, that would be a process of taking different things away. So 5 minus 1 is always 4 in the same sense. So those units, they have to be just identical. But if they are identical qualitatively, they have to be numerically identical. So we cannot work with this classical idea of number, Frege thought. Hegel, on the other hand, in keeping with his routine, makes a punchline, a point out of the inconsistency, and uses this basic contradiction of number as the motor for the development of the logic of quantity. This leads via quantitative infinity and quantitative ratio, proportion or relation, which represent the logical foundations of the different differential calculus, back to quality. Now a quantitatively underpinned quality of the kind that has become stylistically characteristic of modern physics via the differential calculus. With the regression of quantity into quality, and that's a long story in Hegel, and I just give the bare bones here, not even the bare bones, less than them. So with this regression of quantity into quality, at first glance, a logical great circle, Großkreis, is closed, which could mean that the logic has already reached its contradiction-solving goal, so that we would have arrived at the end of the logic. For in the logical great circle, the contradictions do not affect each other directly, but are drawn safely apart. Think, for comparison, of the plant, whose life stages, germ, bud, bloom, fruit, then again germ. The plant whose life stages each drift incoherently beyond themselves, but whose entire circular process is the truth about the plant. However, if nothing else were added, the great circle, at least here in the logic at this point, would be a kind of hamster wheel and an eternal restless return of the same. Logical truth must therefore also, on the other hand, have been summarized in a final thought and have come to rest in this thought. In the case of the absolute idea, at the end of the whole logic, one may expect that. On the one hand, the absolute idea should lead back to the immediate beginning and thus close the great circle, the great logical circle. And on the other hand, it should be the thought of the logical method, methodos or hodos, way or path, the whole path that has led from pure being to it, to the absolute idea. So that would be fine if it turned out that way at the end of the logic. But we are not yet that far here, not the end of the logic of quantity. At this end, this doesn't happen. The supposed great circle of the logic of being, although it is closed with quantity going back into quality, is not yet summarized in an articulated thought of a great circle. Instead, it collapses into, as Hegel says, the simple relation of the quantum to itself, which as a qualitative quantum is an immediate measure. Now we're going on to measure. immediate measure, namely, at first, an immediate specific quantum, such as the quantum by which a pasture, let's say, differs upwards from a vast prairie and downwards from a little dooryard lawn, or the specific size of human beings by which they differ upwards from elephants and downwards from mice. Even the end of the logic of measure, and thus of the logic of being as a whole, is not yet a conciliatory one. It is true that at this end, the whole logical development of the logic of being has ultimately contracted into a final thought, but alas, into an antinomic one, not as hopefully in the absolute idea, but here it's an antinomic final thought datum. It is the antinomic thought of eternal being, which was to be grasped in the beginning, but could not be grasped purely for itself, but only together with negativity, and which was the hidden basis of the whole logical evolution of being. It has now finally emerged from the logical underground as a logical fact and thought datum of its own. In the guise of this fact and datum, it is now the underlying substrate of two alternating states, Zustände, states, as Hegel calls them. The states, of course, are quality and quantity, alternating at eternal being as their substrate. So in a way, the final thought of the logic of being encompasses the whole process of the logic of being, quality, quantity, two states, and being, eternal being, their substrate. Or rather, they are the logical successors of quality and quantity, those states. Two states in inverse ratio or inverse relation to each other, whose alternation at eternal being amounts to an all-round contradiction and makes eternal being pass over into absolute indifference. That is, a Spinozian, or if you like, Schellingian night in which all cows are black. Ex contradictione quod libet. From a contradiction there follows anything. And insofar absolute indeterminacy, logical chaos, indifference. So far, this always threatening indifference could be avoided by the indexical transitory character of the individual successive logical facts. Contradiction was what drove forward. But from eternal being, as the constant substrate of the evolution, there can no longer be a time-like transition through longitudinal negation to a successor fact. If the logic is not to fail in the all-round contradiction of absolute indifference, a progression of unknown type must be possible, which is no longer a time-like passing over to successor stages of logical space, or a space-like shadowing of subspaces of it, but would have to reconceptualize logical space as such. What is sought, therefore, is a new kind of negation, one that does not, as negation did in the logic of being, leave the negated behind or beside it, that does not sublate it and itself into something idealized and then collapse into the one, which in turn passes into quantity, then into measure, and finally into indifference. Something new, a new form of negation is needed. Perhaps a virtuoso of pure thinking could find it at once and accomplish it with sleepwalking certainty. But we want to construct it argumentatively in our background logic and this designer perspective. Thinking and being have belonged together in the logic of being from the very beginning. Thinking was directly at its thing, being. Thinking and being were in fact one. But this fact-oriented, fact-enriched thinking has proven to be untrue. If further thinking is still to be possible, it must completely abandon the supposed thing, the supposed object, and withdraw completely from it and be satisfied with itself as an objectless seeming or shine. If we reinterpret thinking as absolute shine, the antinomy of negation, which is the basic problem, could possibly be stabilized. Of course, the absolute shine that would thus remain as the sole remnant of being is not the affirmative fact and the new logical space that we are looking for, and to which the new unknown, still thought negation is supposed to lead us. For a start, we must rather concede that the new logical space is still entirely hidden behind shine. Thought, which is shining emptily in itself, cannot penetrate to this space, cannot transcend to this logical space. Thought remains enclosed in the immanence of its own shining and seeming. But the inaccessibility of the new logical space to immediate comprehension already suggests a name for it. We may call it the essence in advance. Whatever it may be then. We don't know what essence is, but it may give it the name already. We can call it the essence in advance because it is the hidden basis of everything that has so far shown itself in the foreground logic. The hidden essence behind being which, according to our diagnosis, has regressed to absolute shine. Whatever logical space in its new guise as essence will turn out to be, it is the source that has always already posited shine as shine, that has posited being, regressed to shine, as shine. This gives us an important clue to the general negation of being that we are looking for, which is to lead to essence. The general negation must be the operation of positing, by means of which being has always already been posited by shine, as shine by essence. I repeat, sorry. The general negation must be the operation of positing, by means of which being has always already been posited as shine by essence. The logic of being began with something seemingly found and given, qualitative being there, Dasein, that could then at best be sublated in the further logical progression. In the logic of essence, we are now dealing with the counter movement to sublating, that is with positing. What seemed or shun to be being there, or Dasein, is in fact only being posited, Gesetzsein. The entity being there was only an entity being posited, something negated. Dasein is only Gesetztes. But in the logic of being, it was posited like something affirmative. That was the flaw of being, so to speak. Shine, however, as all that remains of the sphere of being, is now the negative posited as negative. With the investigation of shine, not with that of essence as such, the logic of essence must begin, because essence is still hidden at the beginning. But it is clear from the outset that shine is not opposite to essence, like something is opposite to another, but that it is essence's own shining, that it must be clear that essence is shining within itself, or is reflection within itself, and thus produces or posits shine. This empty shining within itself is the topic of the logic of reflection, the first out of 3 sections of the logic of essence. For the first time, we have here a coming apart and a separation, not yet of subjectivity and objectivity, but of thinking qua shine or reflection and being qua essence. Shine is a logical precursor of subjectivity, one could say, and essence is a logical precursor of objectivity. In the logic of the concept, there will then be a section on subjectivity and one on objectivity, and a third one on their connection or union in the absolute idea, or in the idea first. Here, at the beginning of the logic of essence, admittedly, the connection is still missing. We are entirely on one side, on the side of subjective thinking, so to speak, which stands in its own way as shine. It stands in its way, in its own way as shine, and closes itself off within itself, as if the all-round window of transcendence onto objective being or essence had become a mirror. So think of a room with an all-round window. When you look out of the window and see objective being, but now the window turns into a mirror and you just see yourself. So, okay, the all-round window of transcendence has turned into a mirror in which thinking reflects nothing but itself, therefore reflection. Shine is reflection. Transcending, by the way, in an appropriate term, is an appropriate term also, transcending, by the way, is an inappropriate term also for the logical relationship between thinking and being in the logic of being. Because there, this relationship was still quite immediate. There's no transcending from one side to the other. In the logic of being, thinking did not transcend to being. It was identical with being. The term transcending only becomes appropriate in the continuation of the logic of essence, when in its second section on appearance and in itself, the connection in the relationship between reflection and hidden essence begins to build up. For now, what is important is that essence cannot be grasped directly, but only through reflection. We don't know yet how, but that's the only way. Hegel clarifies these relations in the third subsection, C, reflection, of the first chapter, Shine, the logic of essence, by distinguishing between 3 types of reflection: positing reflection, external reflection, and determining reflection. Insofar as reflection is positing, it does not yet make any claims that go beyond itself. It stays at home, so to speak. What is posited is there, is the case, or exists only by and for reflection. In this way, positing reflection is the basic movement of subjective idealism. So subjective idealism, what is posited is there only for the positing eye and not independently. Okay, the basic movement of subjective idealism, which many people, among them Hegel, wrongly, I think, attribute to Kant and Fichte, as if Kant and Fichte wanted to say that the world was our subjective makeup. Positing reflection stays at home, so to speak, in its inner room, with no windows, but with mirrors only. A reflection which, with a claim to transcendence, to objectivity, to leaving the room, on the other hand, is presuppositional. It posits something behind the mirrors, as really there outside, and thus becomes an external reflection on the presupposed reality. The thought movement of presupposing is characteristic of natural consciousness, of our everyday natural consciousness, and its duality of in itself and for consciousness that the phenomenology of spirit was talking about. So this duality of in itself and for consciousness, characteristic of finite and fallible cognition, and thus prepares the ground for the philosophical dogma of metaphysical realism. Presuppositional reflection in its positing cancels out its positing. It is a positing of the posited as not posited, but as being there, being the case, existing independently of the positing. This is how we proceed in our everyday truth claims, which differ from our everyday performative acts, such as promising, precisely in that they do not make themselves true, but of their truth, if they are true, to an independent real. If I promise to pay a certain amount of money to somebody, I thereby make it the case that I ought to pay that. So the promise is posited and is then real. But if I posit in a truth claim that it is raining outside, well, I'm not responsible for the rain outside if there is rain. So this is truth claims and performative acts differ in this respect. Truth claims do not make themselves true. But presuppositional reflection is then external to this real and does not touch or grasp it. And so its claim to transcendence to the real remains unsatisfied. If the real is independent of what I think about it, how can I have a guarantee that what I think about it is true? What favors metaphysical realism thus simultaneously drives into metaphysically realistic skepticism, to which the real becomes a thing in itself that is in principle unknowable. The way out of this conundrum is offered by determining reflection, which is logically entangled with the thing or object itself. Logical entanglement is my term for an important discovery by Kant, namely for his discovery of the nature of the relation of our pure concepts to the spatio-temporal real. Logical entanglement, by the way, is the logical archetype of nomological, quantum mechanical entanglement that Einstein denounced as spooky, but grudgingly had to accept in the end. What may seem spooky about determining reflection at first glance is that its spontaneous determining exactly captures the determinations of the thing without real interaction, without a flow of information. But a better word for spooky here is simply logical. A memorable illustration of this non-invasive, softly conservative determining is reading a simple text. Here, the shared written language of author and reader serves as a substitute for logical entanglement, insofar as it mediates between the written text and the meaning read. The meaning cannot be taken perceptively from the characters in sensibility. Otherwise, even illiterates and even animals would see it, but must be spontaneously posited and projected onto the characters in reading. Not inventively and invasively, however, but completely conservatively, so that the projection reveals precisely the meaning encoded in the characters by virtue of the author's intention. In this way, by virtue of logical entanglement, we project, according to Kant, categorical form onto the spatio-temporal real. And in this way, too, according to Fichte, the structure of the absolute I onto the absolute. Thus, Hegelian logic in appealing to determining reflection, is closer to these predecessors than Hegel believes, who always secretly or openly suspects them of subjective idealism. Like Hegel, they also place the logical entanglement of thinking and being, and thus determining reflection, not positing reflection, at the center of their thinking. In Hegel's logic, determining reflection enters into operation, above all, in the third book as the activity of the concept. In the first book on being, as we now see in retrospect, from the vantage point of the logic of reflection, positing reflection dominated. We didn't know that when reading the logic of being, but we see it in retrospect. That was all posited. In the middle book, the doctrine of essence, external reflection is in the foreground. However, the logic of essence, looked at more closely, is the place where at first positing reflection still prevails in the section on the determinations of reflection, and in the end, already determining reflection in the activity of substance. Thus, above all, the middle section of the logic of essence, on appearance and thing in itself, remains the natural place of external reflection. With regard to the determinations of reflection, that is, identity, difference, and contradiction in 1813, or identity, difference, and ground in 1830, it should be noted that in their sequence, the well-known double way out of the antinomy of negation, together with the apparetic overall perspective, is again striking, with which we began today. The determinations of Dasein, namely the something identical with itself, the other, and the finite that rose to infinity, were ground floor determinations of being and thinking. The determinations of reflection now that take their place are upper floor determinations of empty thinking that tries to look down on being, which, however, is still invisible here. In the logic of being, non-well-founded negation was contaminated with qualitative Dasein and ran along that Dasein. Now it emptily runs along itself, yielding, firstly, pure identity in the upper floor instead of the something identical with itself in the qualitative ground floor. Second, pure difference instead of the qualitative other. And third, pure contradiction that goes or falls to the ground, zugrunde gehen, it's a German idiom, that is it perishes, instead of the contradictory finite that rose to the infinite. From the ground to which contradiction has fallen or gone emerges the determination of existence as the essence logical air of Dasein. See, existence is the essence logical air of Dasein, and this is the reason why Hegel uses these two different terms, which normally in German are synonymous. Dasein, existence, well, there's no difference between them. But there are these two words, one Germanic, one Latin, and Hegel can use them. One word for the logic of being, Dasein, and the other word for the logic of essence is existence. Okay, so existence is the air of Dasein, and then the thing is the air of the entity being there, Daseiendes, and the something, etwas. Okay. Oh, I skipped the existent. So the airs are following three airs. Dasein, Daseiendes etwas, logic of being, and now Existenz, existierendes, and thing as the new terms that Hegel uses. These are the first traces of something like substantial essence after our exclusive preoccupation with shine and reflection. And with them, the sphere of appearance opens up with its characteristic dualities of essence and existence, existent in itself and appearance, whole and parts, force and its expression, and finally the outer and the inner. These topics are treated in the middle section of the logic of essence. The identity of the outer and the inner is eventually established in the logical fact of actuality, Wirklichkeit, or energeia in Greek, which forms the topic of the last section of the logic of essence. Qua actuality, essence is no longer hidden behind shine or shadowed by appearance, but manifested. And manifested essence is substance. Thus, logical space is now the singular, infinite, more or less Spinozian substance, and qua substance, the power over its accidents. This makes it possible, and that's an interesting thing, to reinterpret the entire evolution of logical space so far from pure being to substance as a continuous change of the accidents or modifications of logical space caused by logical space itself in the role of substance. Logical space is substance, and logical space itself, qua substance, has caused the change of its accidents that we have studied up to now. Logical space is thus qua substance a power over its evolution and the cause of the change of its accidental formations. Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi considered the Spinozian substance to be the last word in philosophical system building and believed that from its inner necessity and causality, no theoretically regulated progression to free subjectivity was possible, but at best an intellectual salto mortale into the belief in a free personal God. So if one did not want to be content with the fatalism of substance with Spinoza, and if one appreciated freedom, one would have to leave philosophy and believe in God. That's Jacobi. Hegelian logic, however, brings substance into interaction with itself as an active and a passive substance, and in this reciprocal self-interaction, he finally offers a regulated progression from the sphere of essence and its opaque necessity into the sphere of the concept and its transparent freedom. So he goes beyond Jacobi and shows a way out of philosophical system building and fatalism, a philosophical way out into the philosophy of the concept. And this will be the topic of the next and last lecture. Thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you very much. We should thank Professor Koch for his wonderful lecture. Personally, I have learned quite much from that. And now we are honored to invite Dr. Zhili from Peking University as our commentators. Yeah, Mr. Xiong, please.
Thanks for the invitation and Professor Koch's content-rich lecture. It is very, I personally think it's extremely difficult to compress such rich content of Hegel's logic in a single lecture. We actually start from near the beginning of the logic to almost the end of the logic of essence. That would be a very tremendous work. So thank you again for this lecture. Okay, I'm going to begin with my comments, and as last time, I'm going to summarize the content of Professor Koch's lecture first and read some general questions afterwards. First is a small retrospect for the content of last lecture. Last time, we were arriving at the logical category of Hegel's logic called the other itself. The reciprocal negation between the logical categories, something and other, gives rise to their interchangeability and hence their relativity. The triviality of their difference ends up with their common characteristic, the iterative alteration to its other, or the other of the other, or simply the other itself. That's what we were arriving at last time, and also the starting point of our lecture today. Okay, next page. The way to the infinity. First, the finitude. Given that double negation yields affirmation, the other itself can both be grasped as self-negation and self-identity. Their entanglement involves their limits or finitude respectively. But this finitude is iterative, and its iteration leads to an infinite process, which, as a direct opposite of the finitude, however, only repeats the finite paradigm of something and other. So it is a vicious infinity in this sense. It has no end. Okay, next page. And how comes the true infinity as idealization? The true or affirmative infinity, in contrast to the vicious or the negative infinity. The true infinity consists in sublation or idealization of both finitude and infinity. And this, by this infinity, I mean the vicious or the negative infinity, which has no end. It posits their opposition only in order to manifest itself by negating both of them. It is, in this sense, being for itself. And this being for the self gives way to the idealization or the rise of the one. The idealization of the being for itself or true infinity leaves nothing else but the true infinity itself alone. Therefore, it is also being for one, or simply the one. Because the one only consists in negation, and now there is nothing but itself, so it negates or repels itself from itself, and in this way generates the many ones. The many ones violates, however, the principle of identity of indiscernibles. This untruth further leads to the attraction of many ones back to the one, which initiates another round of repulsion again. The equilibrium of attraction and repulsion of many ones gives rise to quantum. The qualitative development finally results in its self-relation, which incurs its return to the quantified quality or mirror. This process has to be extremely compressed. So it could be that the summary itself also seems quite obscure. But I think this is also what we have to pay in order to go over the large breadth of Hegel's logic. And after the logic of mirror, at the end of this logic of mirror, we find the absolute indifference. The all-around contradiction, which happens at the end of the logic of mirror, or equivalent to the absolute indifference, which is iterative alternation. Sorry, it's not alteration, but alternation between quality and quantity based on their substrate, being. So the being turns out to be a very eternal and constant substrate. It's called the being, which we find at the beginning of the logic of being. This is very subtle point of Hegel. And this all-around contradiction makes a logical explosion. This is also a result of common logical fallacy. Maybe we should say a falsity, a logical falsity. And this logical explosion or the logical falsity is avoidable so far by the logical indexicality that Professor Koch introduced last time. But now in the end of logic of being, we have no other choice but to face this logical explosion in the end, because we have no other way to get out of this logical explosion or contradiction. Okay, next page. And then we got to the logic of essence. At first, the shy. The all-around contradiction of the being implies its falsity, as said, the logical explosion, or the absolute indifference. So it proves that the logical being is, in this sense, false. It follows that instead of reality, which the logic of being aims at in the first place, the being is merely a shy. The thing that behind the being and causes its all-around contradiction is something that is inaccessible to thinking. It is, in this sense, the essence, what we do not know that behind the being, but functions somehow its own all-around contradiction. And then the reflection. Since the essence is not directly accessible to thinking, we can only gain access to it through reflection. Different stances that thinking takes in its relation to the reality result in three types of reflection. First, the positing reflection, which is equivalent to subjective idealism. Second, external reflection, or the metaphysical standpoint of our naive consciousness, or simply as naive realism or direct realism. And the last one, determining reflection. In Hegel's sense, it can be also called the objective idealism, or in Professor Koch's term, logical entanglement, which can be very difficult to understand for the, especially for people who are not so familiar with logic and the quantum mechanics, because this quantum, we're all familiar with, at least in the literal science, with the quantum entanglement. But this logical entanglement, in which sense that can be the foundation or the logical foundation for the quantum mechanics, that would be difficult to understand in this sense. And the last one is the actuality. After some development which parallel or equivalent to the logic of Dasein, the hidden essence finally manifests itself as the substance, the last part of the logic of essence, and the necessity, which, however, jeopardize our freedom, as Jacobi points out. So how Hegel would find a way which can avoid this jeopardization, we shall see in the next lecture from Professor Koch. And the last is some general questions from my side. And this time it's 3 questions instead of 2 in comparison to the last time. The first is, does the ideality for Hegel mean the epistemic fallibility, or epistemic internalism, in the sense that the ground for justification must be accessible to us, because the logic of infinity equals to, Hegel used the example of consciousness to illustrate the infinity. But the consciousness in this sense is seems more like a hint at his epistemic internalism rather than the epistemic fallibility. So I wonder if the epistemic internalism would be more appropriate for Hegel to characterize his position in true infinity. The second question is, does epistemic fallibility depend on objectivity or the other way around? If the latter is the case, then Hegel seems right about the idealistic position of philosophy in general, because the claim to objectivity depends on, at least for me, it seems depends on epistemic fallibility, rather other way around. So it seems epistemic fallibility in the end is the last word instead of the objectivity. And the last question, does thinking's retreat from the being in its own shine means that the identity of thinking and being falls apart now at the beginning of the logic of essence, whereas it is entailed by our working hypothesis at the beginning of our quest? Okay, thanks. That is all my questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Xiong, for your summary of my summary. That was a hard job you had.
Yeah,
brilliant.
indeed.
Look, you did it. So, for your questions. Well, yeah, let me go through those questions. I have them here. Does the ideality for Hegel mean the epistemic fallibility? Well, I think epistemic fallibility is a category more belonging to the phenomenology than to the logic. Fallibility is what is characteristic of our natural consciousness. So apart from Hegel, in my own philosophizing, I used to start from our practice of raising everyday truth claims. Raising truth claims. And we raise truth claims in such a way that we claim at the same time that what we claim to be true is so not because of our claiming, but independently of our claiming. And so this independence of what is true from positing or claiming it, that's the objectivity. Okay, so in that sense, objectivity is a basic concept that goes together with the practice of raising truth claims. And objectivity is, I would say, just the other side of the same of one coin with fallibility. So there is no priority of fallibility over objectivity or objectivity of fallibility, but they belong together, I would say. They are two sides of one thing. And they belong to natural consciousness and to predication, to propositional thinking, which is predicative at its base. And so the ideality in the logic, well, sure, there must be connections between this ideality and our fallibility, but it's hard to work them out because we are here at philosophizing at two different levels, I'd say, logic and well, phenomenology or philosophy of spirit. Ideality, as Hegel explains it here in the logic, is the idea that something exists, in scare quotes, only as sublated and not independently of being sublated. That's the ideality in the negative, with the negative aspect. But in self-idealization, if this negation is turned upon itself, then we get something like a Fichtean I that posits itself, idealizes itself. It's the ideality of itself, and then ideality becomes a certain affirmative aspect, Fichte's I. And so it is Janus-faced, its ideality. So I must confess I have problems of giving an intelligent answer to the first question. It's very difficult. So the second, does epistemic fallibility depend on objectivity or the? Well, I answered that. I think it's just it's two sides of
one coin. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Hegel seems right about the idealistic position. Well, if it's what do you think, Professor Xiong? If it's just gleich ursprünglich, fallibility and objectivity, if they are alike in basicness, what?
Because if the because if the true infinity represents the idealistic position of Hegel, then we should understand that as a kind of sublation of our idealization of all the real things in the consciousness. and Hegel also uses the consciousness as example to illustrate what he really means by true infinity. So I guess maybe that implies a kind of internalism in Hegel's spot, that we understand everything in our consciousness. Or we access to the reality through the consciousness. So in this sense, it seems that the idealistic position is the last word of philosophy instead of realism.
Okay, yeah. If Hegel is right about consciousness and in the phenomenology of the spirit, if he's right there in letting collapse consciousness into absolute knowing, yes, then philosophy philosophy at the standpoint of finitude is wrong. Yeah. Okay. So I have to confess, I'm on the other side here with Heidegger and with materialists and naturalists, but I'm not a naturalist materialist, but a hermeneutic finitist.
Yeah, it's not a blame for your own philosophical position. It's just explanation. What Hegel really thinks by, or what Hegel really mean by the true infinity and his idealistic position.
Yeah, he thinks that this the whole practice of raising objective truth claims is in a way embedded in something more more encompassing, I would say. And so it is just an aspect of the whole of logical space. And if you look at this aspect of logical space and say, that's it, as Heidegger does and I do, then you will end up with finitism. But if you see the whole process, Hegel would claim, you'll understand why the finite cannot be the last word of philosophy. More or less.
Yeah.
Okay, the third question, does thinking's retreat from the being in its own shine mean I think they fall apart now, whereas in the, well, yeah, okay. Thinking gives up any claim to being in contact with what is really there in absolute shine. So thinking withdraws from being and is on its own, enclosed in its inner room, so to speak, metaphorically. Whereas it internal work, yeah, okay. The working hypothesis at the beginning was we have to start with something which is without alternative. And we found being and found out then, if we have to begin like that, then we begin with something that is at the same time being and thinking or intuiting of being. So that was the first result of the working hypothesis. The working hypothesis was we have to look for something to start with, which is without alternative, and which cannot be effectively negated, being. And now it turns out that being negates itself all the way, and now ends up in all-round contradiction. And so we now learn the lesson that this, what we took to be thinking and being, or we had to take it as thinking and being in identity, in fact, is to be conceived as absolute shine, that is, thinking withdraws from its claim to being here. But of course, we don't want shine, we want to arrive at essence behind the shine. So the negation of the logic of being should lead us to the essence and not to shine. Shine is all the remnants of being, but we are looking for something new behind shine.
Okay, so the retreat doesn't mean that we have given up the identity of being and thinking.
Yeah, okay. It means that in a way we are still looking for a connection between them.
Okay.
So we had an immediate identity at the beginning, and this is not the last word, cannot be the last word, immediate identity. Yeah. It must be some speculative or dialectical identity in the end, which I call logical entanglement, an identity by logical entanglement, or by determining reflection, as Hegel would say.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, because the time is missing, so maybe we shall leave the room for the other questions. And if we still have time in the end, we shall back to this question again.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank Dr. Xiong for his excellent comments and Professor Koch for his brilliant answer. And now we come to the stage of question and answers. And first, we would like to invite the Dr. Yang for her question.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Yang.
Okay, not yet, just a doctor student.
Okay, yeah.
I thank Professor Koch for a lecture and thank the host for giving me the opportunity to ask questions. I have two questions. The first question is about absolute indifference. It appears as the last capture of being's logic in the science of logic, making being transit to essence, but almost disappears in the corresponding place of encyclopedia. So I would like to ask which role does it play in Hegel's logic? Namely, how can absolute indifference lead Hegel's logic from being to essence? That is my first question. My second question is about determined reflection. The three types of reflection are the way of essence to acquire its determinations, I guess so, different from the being, which is determined by its opposite as a pair, such as being and something and the other. But the essence is a reflection within itself and determined only by itself. And as a turning back movement, the reflection turns essentially back from the presupposing, in German, das Vorausgesetzt, presupposing, which is at the same time independent of this positive reflection. So the reflection is external to that. Then why can each starting be transformed into inner determination of reflection? Or rather, how can the logical entanglement accomplish the transition from external reflection to determined reflection, especially without a real interaction with the presupposing? That is my questions.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Yang. Absolute indifference. It's true in the encyclopedia, the version of the logic, Hegel doesn't make much of it. But of course, it's always difficult to find out why, just because he has to be short there, or because he now has changed his mind about it. I think the last word on the logic of being is to be found in the 1830 second edition of the Science of Logic. And so I would then stick with this version of the logic, and would prefer the encyclopedic logic only for the logic of essence and for the logic of the concept. I think what is important about the end of the logic of being is that there is something that has gone definitely wrong there. So we have reached an impasse. We can't go any further here in the regular way by time-like indexicality or space-like indexicality. So these things are over now. We have a situation, well, call it absolute indifference or what you want, that is a case of antinomy, an antinomy that cannot be handled with the means of the logic of being. Why absolute indifference? Well, of course, that was the a kind of slogan that referred back to what Schelling had been talked about. You could refer back to Spinoza with that. So, and one could, of course, read it as if Hegel was here criticizing Schelling and saying, look, what you are doing will end in this catastrophe at the end of the logic of being. And you just stay there, dear friend Schelling, and don't advance further. Yes. What is important, I think, about the end of the logic of being is that we have a situation that cannot be treated any longer in the way we did within the logic of being. And so that's something new to be looked for. Call it essence. No? And Hegel opens up another round of the logic. I see that's not a good answer to the details of your question, but for the moment, I think I have no better one. And then the three types of reflection. Yes, in this subsection where he talks about them, Hegel doesn't say much about how we are logically entitled to go from one to the next. He, in a way, just botanizes these types of reflection there, and it's helpful that he does it, because then he'll show them at work in what follows. And yeah, of course, voraussetzen, presuppose in German, but this operation is positing as not posited, as he says. And then we get this thing which is supposed to be there without being posited. So it's something else. It's not what I have posited. It's independently there. And how can I then say something about it? How can I determine it? How can I know something about it? Well, it tends to be the unknowable thing in itself. And the way out ought to be something like logical entanglement, determining reflection, whatever you might call it. But, well, Ms. Young, perhaps tell me what exactly I need to answer in order to satisfy your question.
I think the logical entanglement is between two subjects, not between a subject.
Okay. Oh, I see. Yeah, I got it now. No, I think logical entanglement in this Kantian sense, and that's the point of it. That is the this is the incredible thing that Kant was trying to work out in his transcendental deduction. Logical entanglement is between our pure concepts of the understanding, that is the subjective side, and the categories of the objects themselves, the objective side. That's the logical entanglement that he wanted to prove. Well, it's a good question whether he achieved his goal, whether he realized and succeeded in proving that, but that was his game. And I think Hegel is in the same business. Logical entanglement between a subject and an object. That's the idea. Like in reading, the text is there. I'm not the text. I'm reading the text. You wrote the text. I didn't. So I see the characters and read it. I understand what you have written there. That is, in this sense, the author of the text is another subject. And there it is easy to understand the logical entanglement. But it's hard to understand if there's no other author there, not creating God, but just being or objectivity. And if there's a logical entanglement between objectivity and our subjective thinking, that is difficult to understand or difficult to prove. But this is what Kant was after. And I think Hegel, in a way, is after the same thing. And he thinks he has managed to give this connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for
it's spooky. This entanglement looks spooky, like the entanglement of two photons moving away from each other, and so there is no flow of information between them any longer. No causality possible because the velocity of light cannot be surpassed. But if you make a measurement on one photon, that will have consequences for possible measurements on the other. That was what Einstein couldn't believe. He said, that's spooky. But yeah, he had in the end to confess that it was just like that in quantum mechanics.
It's Hegel the sum eaten with logical entanglement. Hegel's term, if the same as this.
Well, Hegel hasn't. Well, he has various terms: determining reflection, the speculative identity, things like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
It's not immediate identity, but it's an identity of things which, in a way, remain separated, but are still one, like wave and particles in quantum mechanics. The same. You do not understand how a wave can be particles, but they're still the same. They're logically entangled, nomologically, quantum mechanically entangled. So that is the idea of logical entanglement.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. And I should expect further questions here. Yeah, who have questions?
Can you hear me,
Yes.
Mr. Yuan? Hello, Professor Koch. At the beginning, I noticed that there is a phrase, non-will-founded. Could you give us more information about non-will-founded and will-founded, and the difference between them? Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, I borrowed these terms from set theory. So that's the natural habitat of this difference of founded and non-well-founded. In German, we have fundiert und unfundiert, founded, unfounded. In English, it's non-well-founded. So, in set theory, it's an open issue whether we should add to the normal axiom system of Zermelo and Frenkel either the foundation axiom that excludes non-well-founded sets, or an anti-foundation axiom that works with non-well-founded sets. And both possibilities exist. They won't lead to any inconsistency. So you can either have set theory with or without non-well-founded sets. Non-well-founded is, there is no bottom, there is no ground, no foundation. So you have a set and look at the members of the set, and then you look at the members of the members, and the members of the members of the members of the set, and go down and down and down, and there's no end of it. And then, if it's like that, a set is unfounded. If you will reach an end in the empty set, rock bottom, then the set is founded. And so you can apply that to other operations as well. For example, to believing. And this is not about justification of a belief. It's just about the content of a belief. You have a belief. So the content of the belief is, for example, that it's presently raining outside, whatever. So then this belief is founded. The content is something different from the act of believing. But if you just believe that you believe that, this particular act of believing, it will be circular. It will be non-well-founded. For example, a set that has only itself as its only member, like the set omega, there you have a set, you look at the member, and it's again this set. And the member of this member is again the set. And the member of this member of the member is again the set. So it's a circular. This is non-well-founded then. This is the, and you can use non-well-foundedness for whatever operations you like. For example, set formation, there it comes from, or belief, a bit like Fichte, the I believes that it exists and thereby exists, or negation, or affirmation. And then you get non-well-founded negation or non-well-founded affirmation. A non-well-founded affirmation in normal language, in every language, is expressed as this truth-telling sentence. What I now say to you is true. What did you say? Well, I said that what I'm just saying now is true. Or it's wrong, it's false. Those would be unfounded or non-well-founded.
Yeah. Good. Who has the next question?
Professor Koch, can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Thanks a lot for your lecture, Professor. In the part talking about the finite and the infinite, could you please talk more about why the annihilation is an inadequate solution, and what is the relationship between annihilation and sublation? Do they work with each other or totally opposite to each other? Thank you very much.
Okay, the annihilation and sublation. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, annihilation, both are forms of negation. So within the logic, the basic operation is negation. And at the beginning of the logic of my presentation, we took negation just from the propositional calculus. But their negation is propositional negation. You have a sentence, Socrates is wise, and you negate it. It's not the case that Socrates is wise. You have to negate this sentence. The content of the sentence is not annihilated. It's still there. You can always think that Socrates is wise. And it's even sublated in the negation, because if you say Socrates is not wise, this includes that Socrates is wise plus negativity. So it's sublated, it's still present. So within the propositional realm, negation is only just propositional negation, nothing else. But we cannot use this propositional negation for our purposes in the science of logic, because there we don't have propositions, but we have simple thought contents like being and being there, Dasein, and so on. And these simple contents, these simple thought data, have to be negated in another way, not propositionally. So the first way to negate is annihilation. This is longitudinal negation. So at the first stage, we have, let's say, Dasein being there. And then we negate that Dasein. And or let me go back again. The Dasein itself is the result of the negation of becoming. Becoming was non-being, not being, and Dasein is not being, again being, negation of becoming. And this negation leaves becoming behind without trace. So it's annihilation. It doesn't exist any longer in the logical space of Dasein. The logical space of Dasein has no trace of becoming. Becoming is annihilated. You just have Dasein, and so on. So this longitudinal negation is annihilation. But what happens then in the logical space of Dasein is this bipartition, this division of logical space. And there you have a transverse negation. There's a new form of negation, then something and the other, which shadow each other. Okay, this is a space-like negation, not a time-like negation. This shadowing, the otherness. And then within the finite, we have reached an impasse, a problematic situation where the finite, which finite is again the union of something and other. It's the finite that is intrinsically antinomic, negates itself, so annihilates itself. It's annihilated. That is annihilation. The finite annihilates itself, but what results is again the finite, or another finite, an identical finite. And it's like in the temporal sequence, the present moment, the now. The now is, in a way, an example of the finite, because this now lives or exists by having destroyed its predecessor a second ago, no longer there. But this present now will soon vanish and give way to its successor. So, and the finite is a bit like that. So the logical space, qua the finite, always annihilates itself and brings itself back as another finite logical space. So this, and this is the process that Hegel summarizes in the dialectics of Sollen und Schranke, Ort and Schranke, limit or whatever in English, where we always go a step in advance to a next finite, and then this next finite will be surpassed again. It's an infinite progression of finites annihilating each other. And so what leads to something new must again be a new form of negation, and this time idealization. That's Hegel's solution here, that the finite that always perishes, but the finite as such doesn't perish. The finite as such should perish. It always perishes and a new finite arises. But this process as such should be negated. And how that? Well, it has to be idealized. That's the idea here. It's something which only exists as sublated and not independently of being sublated in the true infinite.
Yeah, good. Yeah, who has the next question?
Thank you, Professor Koch. I'm interested in the thesis that a lot of philosophies are incompatible with what Hegel claims, even including your own hermeneutic realism. Could you please talk more about this incompatibility?
Okay, yeah, good question. Thank you. Hegel would diagnose the situation in his way. He would say, no wonder, and the incompatibility is only seeming, it's only shine, because those differing philosophies or metaphysical theories that existed up to Hegel's time, Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, and so on, those metaphysicians, they were right in a certain sense. They were looking at logical space and wanted to give an account of logical space. That's what metaphysics is about. Metaphysics is a kind of logical topology of logical space. But what they didn't take into account is the process of logical space, the evolution of logical space. So it's like a biologist who looks at a plant, and it happens that he looks at the plant when it is blooming, blossoming, and he says, oh, I got the nature of the plant, it's the bloom. Or take another biologist who looks at the plant at the fruit and say, oh, yeah, I got it. That's the truth about the plant, the fruit. And that would be Hegel's diagnosis of the history of philosophy. So those philosophers, they weren't wrong, because there really is the fruit of the plant. And there really is the bloom before the fruit and the bud before the bloom. It's all right there. So all those philosophies still look at aspects of the evolution of logical space and then fix one stage of this evolution and say, I got it. And hold fast to this particular stage of the logical evolution and give an account of that. And then another philosopher gives a differing account of a different stage. And so they come into a conflict. And one says, look, but what is true, logical space is just pure being, Parmenides. Or Plato, no, logical space is the cosmos of forms, of ideas. Or Aristotle, no, logical space, that's the plurality of substances. Or David Lewis, closer to our present day, no, logical space, that's the set of all possible worlds. And Hegel would look at that spectacle, would say, well, I'm the referee in a way here. You're all right, but you don't see the evolution that leads from one position to the next. When I say I'm not a Hegelian, think that the Hegelian picture of it is too optimistic. And that in the end, he won't really be able to reach a fixed point of the logical process where the antinomy is domesticated. He thinks he can domesticate the antinomy of negation in the absolute idea or in absolute spirit, in the philosophy of spirit. But I think he's wrong about that. And I think, therefore, that he gives a lot of information about metaphysics and differing metaphysical theories. So the game of metaphysics in that sense really is done, I would say. He's right in this critical diagnosis of the history of metaphysics. But philosophy, first philosophy cannot be, I would say, a kind of theoretical endeavor in the strict sense of theoretical, namely standpoint free, like physics, because of mathematics. Mathematics is standpoint free. But philosophy in the end must acknowledge that is always philosophy from a standpoint, must be hermeneutical. So that would be my answer to Hegel. He is right in his diagnosis of possible metaphysics, but the consequence to be drawn from that is that philosophy, first philosophy, should stop trying to be a purely theoretical science and should turn into a hermeneutical science a priori.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay, who still have questions?
Guten Tag, Professor Koch.
Guten Tag.
Thanks for your introduction about quality and quantity, but the transition from quality to essence is a little difficult for me. Could you please talk about the transition more? Thanks.
Well, I said so very little about it because it's only 5 lectures. And so it is impossible to say, to really give a satisfying answer here. I'm just hinting at what Hegel was after, nothing more. So I didn't claim that I gave a real explanation of this, of the end of the science of logic of being, and I didn't claim that I showed how Hegel arrived at this end. I just took it as a fact that there at the end of the logic of being, he says, look, we've got this antinomic situation, this impasse that he calls all-round contradiction. So and it's just not possible to work that out in detail in this short lecture. Like I did, I tried to work out the beginning in detail, but then I had to skip and jump to other places in the logical development. As I said in answer to a former question, the situation is that at the end of the logic of being, the means that the logic of being gives us to cope with the antinomy are now exhausted. And so we have a situation where the antinomy seems to be victorious in the end. There's no possibility to go any further in the way we did it before within the logic of being. So if that were the end, then we would have to say, well, the science of logic is in the ruins. It's all in ruins. Our working hypothesis has turned out to be a fantasy. The working hypothesis of a presuppositionist theory. That was the working hypothesis. And now you see, well, it was a weird working hypothesis anyway, and now, yeah, shipwreck. And we don't know how to go on. And then Hegel says, no, there may be still a way out of this conundrum here. If we withdraw the claim that thinking is in contact with being, and let thinking be something which is in contact only with itself, seeming, shine. But we don't want to have shine there. We want to have something real, essence. And this is totally hidden behind shine. And then the next question is, for the essence of logic, how to arrive there behind shine. So, but it's still very skippy and skipping the details.
Vielen Dank.
Bitte, bitte. Gern geschehen.
Okay, it's already 9 o'clock by us. I think it's about 2 o'clock at Germany.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to put an end to this talk. And thank you very much for Professor Koch for your excellent lecture. And thank you for the good questions from my audience. Okay.
Yeah.
See you next Friday. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Yuan. Yeah.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen. Thank you all.
Host.
Yeah.
Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen.
Yeah, Wiedersehen. Yeah, have a nice holiday weekend. Yeah.
Thanks.